Good afternoon. Welcome to the Aspen Institute. I'm Dana Gioia, the Harman-Eisner Director of Programs in the Arts, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to one of our cultural roundtables. And I'd like to thank Michelle Smith and the Robert H. Smith Family Foundation for helping make this series possible. It's my pleasure today to do another of what we think of as a particularly Aspen kind of experience, where we invite the leaders in arts, culture, and education, and give them an opportunity to talk to one of the most important people in the field in the United States today. And I am delighted to have my friend and Jim Leach, the 9th chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities. I first met a person I still think of as Congressman Leach when I was the chairman of the NEA, and he was one of the most informed and supportive members of either House of Congress in terms of the arts and humanities. And I know that I couldn't have been happier, and I suspect most of you shared that emotion when it was announced that he had been appointed the 9th chairman of the NEH. Chairman Leach has a unique background for an NEA chair. I believe he is the only NEA chair in history who was a member of Congress, and in his case, a 15-term congressman from southeast Iowa. He was educated at sort of out-of-the-way places, Princeton, Johns Hopkins, and the London School of Economics. And his background was, from the beginning, an international background. At Hopkins, he did a master's degree in Soviet politics, and he went on in Congress not only to found and co-chair the Congressional Humanities Caucus, but also to serve, and I think, did you ultimately chair the Asia and Pacific Affairs Committee, am I right? Subcommittee, I mean. And he then fled Congress temporarily 2 years ago and taught at both Princeton and Harvard before he was sucked back into the federal government, to our gratitude, to serve as the chair of the NEH. But I think actually his most interesting distinction is not his congressional service, his 8 honorary degrees, but I do believe he must be the only NEH chair in history to also be honored in the International Wrestling Hall of Fame. Certainly good training for Congress. So, welcome to the Aspen Institute. Jim, it's our pleasure to have you here today.
Well, I'm honored to be with you, Dana, and I think Aspen is very fortunate to have, for the first time in my knowledge, a poet in their midst.
Yeah. Well, they hired me despite that.
Despite that, okay.
Well, there's a lot of things we could talk about, but what I wanted actually to ask you a general question that goes back to some of the things that I said in my introduction. You have an absolutely unique and invaluable training for a cultural chairman, which is that you were a member of Congress. You understand the congressional process, which is something that's really fundamental to the success of the cultural agencies. I was wondering, what is your perspective on that? Is that something that you think that will allow you, in a sense, to do a better job at the NEH?
Not necessarily at all, Dana. The cultural agencies are very different than how Congress works, and Congress is an ever-changing institution, and the chimes are ever-changing. And so there are a lot of hills and valleys that are yet to be seen. I think everybody knows we're in difficult times and dealing with issues that are truly unprecedented. I mean, whether we think of ourselves as the first generation in the history of the world that has to deal with the capacity to destroy all of the planet through nuclear weaponry, whether it be the other end of the spectrum geopolitically with the new implosive power of terrorism. And then we have all of these analogies that we've been making for generations about the smallingly of the globe, in which we're living closer together. And does that bring better relations or sometimes rubbing of elbows, making less happy relations. And I think we're having real wrenches with the concept of increased globalism at the same time that people are looking for localist solutions to almost everything. And you're having this tension between globalism and localism, and then you're having new economic phenomenon that we have found have been able to advance economic activity around the world, and at the same time we found that they've been able to contract it. And we're in a contracted few years that we're having to learn to deal with.
Now, coming, out of a couple of years actually in higher education, where you were at two of the leading institutions in the United States, are you bringing specific goals to the NEH right now? Are there 3 or 4 things that you'd really like to accomplish against whatever odds?
Well, first, when you look at, and a lot of people don't understand very well these two, what we call endowments, the arts and the humanities, and let me make a distinction because it isn't often made, but the arts are all about supporting the creative processes, particularly living arts. And the humanities are all about perspective, history, philosophy, literature, and related disciplines. And each operates uniquely with basically only 2 other institutions in America and almost none around the world. The 2 in America being the National Institutes of Health, the National Science Foundation, where we allocate federal funds based on peer review. And so we bring the best and the brightest in America in various fields to assess projects or grants or scholarship of one kind or another. And so when you ask about goals, one is to preserve the institution as it's come into being and has developed a rather wonderful track record. But beyond that, there are challenges of the time. And so I've laid forth 2 what I consider to be initiatives that aren't exactly goals, but there's a hard, kind of a thin line between a goal and an initiative. One I call bridging cultures, where we're looking at putting a greater emphasis on what it is that makes a people, and then what it is that makes people differentiated. And we're a society that has a wondrous national culture, but we are also a mosaic of subcultures. And so understanding ourselves is very important. And then we're looking at a world in which there are a huge number of cultures, some widely disparate, and most of these large cultures have many subcultures too. And so one of the great questions is, can we understand better? And one might say, does that matter? Well, I sometimes suggest that it's always hard to put numbers on programs and their importance. But one can say almost definitively that there is a huge cost of not understanding other cultures. And by huge, it's how you interrelate with the world commercially, as well as whether you have a war and peace. And you asked me about Congress. I will tell you, one of the things that I find absolutely astonishing is that the United States of America was involved in a war in the Persian Gulf, the first Gulf War under the first President Bush. But as we led up to the second war that we didn't know was coming, I don't think there were very many members of Congress that had the foggiest idea that there was a difference between Sunni and Shia. And I don't think there were that many in the United States government that did. And what that means is that we as a country have to think more. And then if you go internally, we have become, in many ways, a much richer culture in terms of people from more and more lands that have come here, and people that interrelate with their past experience with the American experience, and they do it differently in an Alabama than they do in a New Jersey, and differently yet in an Iowa. And so every year we see differentiations of a different kind. And this is, we can look at as wonderful, or we can say, golly gee, people that are different we don't like. And there's that instinct in all of us on both sides. And so what it is that you try to get people to think more positively about each other. And will tell you, as someone that has traveled this country talking about this concept of civility, it is astonishing what the new American rhetoric is. And we have people that are saying to other people, you're a communist, you're a fascist, or maybe both at the same time. We have other people using words we have not used in American vocabulary for a century. The word secession is now rife and alive in the United States of America. The word nullification is starting to be uttered. And so from the humanities point of view, I'm saying we've got to understand our own history. And we have to understand our own philosophy and how history and philosophy can join. And if we don't, our society is going to have a very hard time hanging together.
Now, have you initiated any programs that are either for broader international exchange or deeper understanding of those principles and experiences in American history that would help build that civility?
Well, we do have a number of things working internationally, some with traditional countries. We'll be announcing in the near future small exchanges with Italy, with a major program with China. But much of our research goes very esoterically. I mean, we've done work with museums in Afghanistan. We've done work with aspects of Chinese culture. There are new fields of research. One is that didn't exist 10 years ago, called the digital humanities. And we've just done a series of exploration with grant opportunities for what we call bridging disciplines, where we're having people apply from grants from more than one discipline, from more than one university, from more than one country as a mandate together. And so we're working with the British equivalent of the NEH, the Canadian equivalent of the NEH, as well as the National Science Foundation to do kinds of research of a very different nature.
Now, if you go to educational organizations, historical organizations in the humanities or the arts, and you ask them what they want from the NEH or the NEA, I think unanimously they will say more money. And this is that they want the money more than the ideas or the strategies or whatever. The U.S. U.S. government is entering an extremely tough period of budgetary demands and budgetary restraints. What is your perspective? Once again, having seen both the agency side and the congressional side of the prospects for the cultural agencies right now, facing these new economic realities.
Well, first let me just say a comment about money in the sense of money is something you transfer for a purpose. And one of the fabulous aspects of the United States is that we transfer money for individuals to do things around the country. In other words, the National Endowment of Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities are not institutions that in and of themselves are producing great art and great humanities projects. They are precipitating the great American citizens to do great art and great humanities research and great humanities translation of research to the public itself. Now, from a money perspective, there's a macroeconomic dilemma that faces every discipline of any kind and every community of any kind, and that is that in the last few years we've seen at a minimum a 20% erosion in the real wealth of the United States of America and of the average American family. And that is could be a little higher than 20%. That means every governmental agency and every governmental unit, from a city to a county to a state to the federal government, has less to draw upon, just as the American family has less to draw upon. And so we're looking at a federal government that has announced the discipline of a freeze on domestic level spending for a 3-year period. And that is something that we in the humanities and the arts will have to cope with. I must say, by perspective, the peak year for both of these endowments was the year 1979, and we were at about 37% in inflation-adjusted dollar terms of where we were then. And so there's been a slippage over time. This president has committed to maintaining the two endowments. The Congress has been committed in the same way. Where we go in the future is anybody's guess, but it's within the context of very difficult times. Now, having said that about the endowments, we are a small part of the American art scene and humanities scene. I was visited this week in what I consider to be a rather stunning circumstance. President Sarkozy of France had sent a representative to find out how America does its culture. That is, the French are looking at how we do things. And I made it very clear to him that in the United States, how we operated in levels of government and types of institutions, but we are principally, in the arts and humanities, a private citizen-oriented circumstance. Many European countries are much more governmentalized in both of these disciplines. And that doesn't mean one system is necessarily better or worse than another. It's how these societies fit with their traditions and cultures and whatever. But if you take the humanities, at every level there's great restraint. State governments are now pulling back their support for higher education dramatically. The average state university used to get 20 years ago over a third of its budget from the states. Now it's far less than 1/6 that. If you take within university communities, the humanities subjects are being downplayed relative to other subjects that are considered more job-centric. Although the interesting thing is when you survey corporate leaders in America, they want more and more people educated in the arts and humanities. They also want them to study business, but they first want them to have a background in other cultures, other languages, in capacity to think. And in terms of dealing with the world, the arts and humanities really are unique in the sense of allowing people to A, learn some perspective, and B, learn how to think imaginatively. And this is a world of change, and where imagination is going to be the key.
If you look at the issues that corporations and business community looks for new hires, their top two complaints are can't write, can't read. Which are essentially skills that you learn in the humanities, or one hopes one learns in the humanities. Right. If I can ask you a question that comes out of what you've just said, if you're talking about these state universities, which are under absolute budget pressure, and then pressure within those universities to penalize the humanities budget disproportionately to other fields, does the NEH have a public role in terms of articulating the rationale for the humanities?
Well, it is hard to say with regard to a specific university. One has to be very careful. But in terms of the role itself of the humanities, absolutely. Sometimes in higher education today, now people are looking at what departments lose the least amount of money or make money. And there's a reason to think those things through, but education is supposed to be education, and there's supposed to be a cost to it. And if you give incentives to go in one direction and you don't in another, it really matters to where people are going to lend. And so I am speaking very strongly to the humanities community that we have to stand up and make it clear that our particular disciplines matter, and they matter a great deal. And if the American university community wants to back off of teaching the humanities, it's going to be a real cost to American society, and a very unfortunate circumstance.
When I was chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts, really about 2 months after I took the job, I had to deal with the first of what became a recurring issue, which was that a state was in the process of taking its Arts Council out of existence. and I had the very fun task of talking to governors and lieutenant governors and majority and minority leaders about the fact that we would withhold federal funds if if they got rid of their arts agency. Do you see any similar trend happening in terms of the state humanities?
Well, first by background, and the arts has the same phenomenon. There is a state humanities council in all 50 states, precipitated by national statute. There's a state arts council in all 50 states, as well as in the territories that we control. And so the NEH and the NEA, in a way, are organized like a mini State Department. That is, we have embassies in each of the states. The distinction being that A, we turn internally, and B, in the State Department, when Washington sends a directive, the ambassador snaps too. When we suggest something, we're in danger of receiving a yawn, but you never know. I mean, but what I'm saying is our state councils are independent institutions. Now, I'm joking about a yawn because they are really good. And it is astonishing what work the state humanities councils do. And people in Washington are very unaware of it, but they really do programs throughout their states that fit their states. People talk differently in South Carolina than they do in Iowa. And programs are tailored differently. And they're wonderful what the state humanities councils do. And for example, they'll have programs in literature, programs in history, in which they reach out to the smallest towns in the state and to odd places. We have a program in Oregon by the state council. It's called Think and Drink. We have programs that are in barbershops in Illinois. I mean, it's really a fabulous outreach, under the assumption that, and this is a bit of an exaggeration, but it's not good enough to have a monk contemplating in a cave if no one can hear the thoughts. And so somehow you have to get a public engaged in such a way that the great books of our time, the great thoughts of our time can be translated in a public venue. And that's what the councils do, and they do it extremely well. Now, having said that, every state council that I know of is looking at a smaller budget than last year. And so there is coming from their states. Now, they also receive some private funds, but as well as they receive about half their resources from the national office. And so there is pressure out there.
Yeah. Now, American museums have a very complicated relationship with the cultural agencies because the NEA funds one type of program, the Institute of Museum and Library Services funds another type of program, the NEH funds a type of program, and all of them receive insurance from the federal council. These museums have gone through this enormous period of expansion during the last 20 years. They've, in many cases, doubled their exhibition spaces, they've increased their staffs. And many of them are undergoing really very, very drastic financial pressure right now. Do you have any perspective in terms of the dealings you've had so far with museums and any ideas from the NEH?
Well, you defined the dilemma. There is hardly a museum in America that isn't under some budget pressure, and many under very intense. And we have vastly more museums in America than the American people really think about. It's a little bit like my state is and no one's ever exactly counted it. We're a state of 40,000 ponds. And museums across this country are like ponds. They're everywhere. And it's wonderful. But it's also, in difficult economic times, hard to keep up. But it tells you, because of the variety of them, people really want to have something to do with their county's history, with some sort of, in some cases, there's a brand new museum, and I recommend people see it in Columbia, South Carolina, that's largely art from Switzerland. And if you like Giacometti, it's not bad. These are new things happening in this country all the time. And I am very, very worried about the state of museums, because if you just visualize a museum, right away you think of something hard to heat, an air condition. And the cost of energy is driving them nuts. And it's one of the reasons, by the way, we have programs on not only preservation of paper, but programs that relate to how people can go in new ways to heat and air condition.
Well, so when you said the difficulty of heating and air conditioning, Chase Rind, who runs the National Building Museum, who has probably the largest lobby in the world, I think was nodding his head. Before we open the roundtable up for questions from our guests, I wanted to ask you one question. Then also, I know there's a person that you want to honor or mention after that. You are wearing, I don't think our cameras can pick this up, a little lapel pin that says civility. And I know this is become a kind of personal campaign for you as NEH chair. Would you like to say a little bit more about it? You mentioned it a little bit earlier, but...
Well, all I will say is that if Americans don't pay attention to civil discourse or difficulties, I used to joke that I discovered the fourth Newtonian law. And by that I mean, if any of you have studied physics, the third law of Isaac Newton was that for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. Well, the fourth law I call law of social physics is that in social physics, reaction can be greater than action. And so I called Dana a bum. He's likely to call me something a little larger. If I ignore him, that's not going to advance relations. And then you can enlarge that to international affairs. If I call Finley's country evil, what's Finley going to respond? Is he going to reform, or is he going to snap back? And there are aspects of this that happen all the time. I might just say, and I'll just conclude with this, that I think it's, to be topical of the month, it's important for the Supreme Court of the United States to protect uncivil speech, but it's important for the public to filter it. But it's also important for the Supreme Court of the United States not to allow corporate speech to drown out citizen views. I am one of the few that think that it's a matter of civility when a court rules that we're going to have an American political system that is going to have an enlarged role for corporations rather than citizens. And what we have to have is a political system in which citizens can speak their views with great vigor. In fact, argumentation is a social good. And you can't block tyranny or dogmatism without argumentation. But how you argue is a civil concern. And we're going to have to think this through from a legal system as well as from a circumstance of individual citizens talking to each other.
Yeah. And that's also the power of culture. If culture breaks down, the laws themselves, really can't entirely fill the gap. Now, Chairman Leach, I know that there is one of our guests at the roundtable today that you want to say a few words about.
Well, I just wanted to recognize Albert Small. And the reason I do, gentlemen, is that Albert has just won the National Humanities Medal and couldn't come to the ceremony with Ted Sorensen and Frank Stella et al. And so I think he deserves being noted. And Albert, you have been one of the Albert stands out uniquely as one of the great benefactors of the humanities. He has put together one of the greatest intellectual collections that I have known of in American history, including several of the original Declarations of Independence, which are words that we're very proud of, and given them to the University of Virginia, where there's a center named for Albert. And thank you, Albert.
Good. With that brief encomium, I'd like to open up the table for questions. Do we have any of our members? If you ask a question, I think we need to wait, either be at a mic or wait for one of the traveling mics to get to you. And before you ask the question, can you introduce yourself and mention your organization? Do we have a question? Tevi Troy.
Yes, I'm Tevi Troy with the Hudson Institute. I'm very interested in this, your civility campaign. I'm a fan of promoting civility. One thing I often notice that I think contributes to a lack of civility is the sort of sense that when your team makes the argument, it's fine, but when the other team doesn't, you see this with, let's say, the filibuster. When the Republicans are in the majority, they think the filibuster is terrible. When the Democrats are in the majority, they switch sides depending on where they stand. And so I think that contributes to lack of civility. But I'm interested in some of your thoughts on where civility, where the breakdown of civility came from and what we can do to fix it.
Well, first, I mean, America's always had issues. I mean, Walt Whitman used to talk about we had an athletic democracy, and by that he meant things were rather rugged. I mean, we debated immigration back in the 19th century quite vigorously. We debated slavery, I mean, thinking of fundamental things, and we had more than a little violence. I mean, after all, a vice president of the United States shot dead the Secretary of the Treasury, and that's very seminal. What's different today is, I think, new communications technology, the profoundness of the issues of the day, and some debilitating aspects of American politics. And a lot of this relates, and to me, very intriguingly, we think of issues. Our founders were probably, of all generations of people, other than maybe the 5th century BC, that talked about not just the rights of man, but the nature of man. And they looked at people as with all their foibles, et cetera, and that's why we developed the system of all these checks and balances in government. But I think that the nature of politics is something that deserves a lot of attention. And I like the words, although it's with using a little different meaning, of Whitman about athletic democracy. If you think of our culture, there are very few things more innately American that's competitive than sports, and almost all kinds. But very intriguingly, in athletics, we're seeing this new basketball tournament coming out again this year, but the teams are all taught to work like mad, to work together, and to respect the opposition. And you don't see that to anything like the degree in American politics. And so my modest suggestion is kind of a cultural one. Can we bring politics up to sports? And that is a very interesting thought. Now, the issues are a bit different, but and possibly quite deeper. But I think, I mean, we have. I mean, Finley was a journalist for a while, sir, and but as you know, many people, and I would put myself in this category, turn to the sports page before we turn to the news page. And there's a reason for it. And the other aspect of sports, it implies all these wonderful local loyalties. I mean, we all have our team, and how terrific that is. And we also, again, respect the others. Now, if you could teach respect, I think we'd be a long way down the line.
Cherie Harder.
Thanks. I'm Cherie Harder with the Trinity Forum. Related to Tevi's question, I wanted to ask you more particularly about how the role you saw between the humanities and civility, and how the humanities can be used to increase civility. And then related to that, somewhat facetiously, why you think it is that faculty politics are so noted for their nastiness.
Okay. Well, first, an aspect, but I consider a minor aspect of humanities as well as civility are things like etiquette. But the real aspect that is civility is whether one is interested in the other person, the other society, the other circumstance. And so it's engagement, it's respectful engagement, and hopefully with a little bit of curiosity. That is, I think curiosity is this great underestimated concept. that we all ought to be wondering, why it is that your hair curls. I mean, what it is that's different about people. Now, politics is always complicated in many different ways by what I call the A word, and the A word is ambition. And in almost every political circumstance, you have ambition between parties and very much within parties. And you have ambition that is very personal at a time that, again, if you go back into philosophy, the conceptualizations of the common good, the greatest good of the greatest number, the larger concepts are now not being thought through very much. I mean, people are thinking, can the Republicans win next week? Can the Democrats prevail? Well, what does that mean? That doesn't mean, can we do something good for the country? I mean, it's a very different conceptualization. And then the unstated aspects of politics are pretty heavily oriented with the I word. And sometimes you pick it up with people's manner of speech, actions, but it's deeply invested.
Bob Lynch.
Bob Lynch, CEO of Americans for the Arts. And actually, I'd like to start off simply by saying congratulations and complimenting the new chairman for his stellar voting record in Congress in support of the arts and the humanities. So over 30 years, just always there. But my question is about the image and the value proposition of the humanities today. I think that sometimes the image and the concept of the humanities is not as well understood as the actual humanities themselves and how they're used. And a couple of examples. In my work, I get to go to a different American city every week. And as I go to these cities, I see people like Mayor Cicilline in Providence reference his cultural policy by using historical data about the Industrial Revolution in that city. And I see somebody like Mayor Mufi Hanneman in Honolulu talk about religion and its basis for their cultural policy and city advancement, and many, many others like that around the country. Those things are the humanities, but very few people ever speak about the humanities. And so I think that there's a disconnect with the citizenry in general. And I actually think that's the case for the arts too, where people sometimes will talk about, in our research, not necessarily valuing the arts as much as they value jazz or attending museums, as if there's no connection between those two things. So I'm curious if you observe this, and if there's something about the concept of the humanities and the arts from a visibility and a value proposition that you would suggest.
Well, what I think you're trying to say is that there is kind of this conceptualization that the arts are artsy. And that somehow has a implication that both of elitism and non-strength. And actually, the arts are about culture, and they're about bringing out the most imaginative in American society. The humanities are about depth. And in a world which is muscular, sometimes people underestimate this. I can't visualize the United States Army being wisely used unless there wasn't a great deal of cultural understanding of where it's going to be used for. And I think people have to realize that they matter a lot. Now, in our society, and frankly, every society, there is an element of anti-intellectualism, and sometimes intellectuals are anti-other intellectuals. I mean, so never, of course, never, and certainly there are no rivalries in academia. But the fact is, just as you say, psychologically, there's something that isn't presented in the right way. And how you turn arts and humanities into a muscular set of terms is very intriguing. And now that doesn't mean it should be exactly the same way, but how you can have a strong society without strong arts and society, I don't know.
Shane Doty.
Hi, Shane Doty, Washington National Opera, and soon to be Asia Society in New York. I think in addition to the concept of sort of high and low culture and relevancy, also there is the issue of borders, and I'm constantly telling my staff that the whole public doesn't see the cultural borders between high and low, or in our case, opera or musical theater, or even pop music, the way we've generally treated them. And so in making a difference, we go to the actual experience. And do you see any kind of initiatives in terms of addressing sort of this maybe miscommunication or disconnect with a large percentage? I remember Beverly Sills being asked about Bohème on Broadway, and just immediately she said, well, it's not an operatic experience, but it could be a very exciting theatrical experience. And I thought, she didn't just put down that person's the relevancy of their experience. So.
Well, the word borders has many implications, and certainly borders between art disciplines are very interesting in breaking down. The Chinese have a multi-millennium tradition of painting with poetry. One of my favorite movements post Picasso and Braque was Robert Delanie, when he started a movement called Orphism, which was intended to be involve music with painting, which is an interesting conceptualization. But there are lots of overlaps. I know, just as a young person, one of the great other kinds of borders. I was a student of Russian, and on a group of young kids pledged only to speak Russian, and traveling through Russia, and in a little town in what was called the Gruzinskaya Republic, which was Georgia, in Russia. One Sunday, there were this group of kids that were singing an Elvis Presley album. And I went up to them, and I'm speaking Russian, but I soon found they couldn't speak a word of English, but they could sing Elvis. And there was a former president of Oberlin who wrote a book on the importance of jazz in the second Russian Revolution, that is, the revolution that toppled communism, suggesting that jazz was the first emanation of real freedom of some Russians, and that it had a phenomenal ramification in movements towards political freedom. And so you had the transmigration of music to politics. And I think that these aspects of the creative mind work in hugely different ways on different people at different times in different environments, all of which is fabulous.
Albert Small.
This is, Jim, probably a little more basic than some of the other discussions, but I'm concerned about the youth of our country. They're the ones who are going to decide whether the humanities and the arts are going to thrive in the future. Now, every newspaper in the country has a sports section every day. There's only one paper that has a cultural section every day, is the New York Times. So you see there's a big disparity between sports overall in the country and culture. And every time I turn television on, I see sports. On the weekends, you see sports. and there's so much money involved in the professional sports that it dominates a lot of things. And I don't know the answer to it, but I'm just posing the question because everybody here gets a newspaper every day. And every day the sports section's right in there. And I think the young people of the country, that's where their heads are. And it's not us in this room, it's the young people, the youth, that are going to shoulder and carry the burden or thrive in the arts and humanities. So.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate that perspective about the youth. My sense, though, is I wouldn't write it off too quickly. I mean, as was mentioned by Shane, music is a pretty driving thing in American society, and youth are really into it in many different ways. The things that I'm concerned about are really a little bit more on the humanities side, because history is no longer as fashionable as it once was. The discipline isn't there. And there are lots of things that are not being studied today. And these indicators that, and we all hate indicators, but about youth not knowing when the Civil War occurred, I mean, are really dramatically significant. And so how do you have a sense of perspective? I mean, it's really worrisome. And the other thing is that's new, and absolutely new. And I used to, as a member of Congress, give lectures to 7th and 8th graders. And I would start out by saying everyone's heard what every parent has ever said, you have to learn from your own mistakes. But we're in a world that we have to be smart enough to learn from the mistakes of others. And for a kid, if you don't see what drugs do to someone else, you're going to be quite vulnerable to try them. You cannot afford to learn from your own mistakes. And likewise, if you take society, it is true we had an experiment with Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but we can't afford to learn from another major nuclear exchange, because there might not be anyone to learn from. Again, I mean, so there's some things we have to be wise enough to know we're a little different than any other generation. And to me, that means it's more important to study the humanities, to think through the arts, and to participate in arts endeavors. And I worry a lot that school systems throughout the country are giving less attention to some of these subjects.
Dana?
Excuse me, Finley Lewis.
Jim,
Yes,
just to follow up on that, Finley Lewis, Congressional Quarterly. As you know, the No Child Left Behind bill is due for reauthorization. And that's a basic foothold that the Congress has in elementary and secondary school education. As a matter of public policy, if you were in Congress, what would you like? How would you use the opportunity of the reauthorization of that bill to deal with some of the problems that you're discussing today?
Well, first, I would like to stress I'm a little beyond the presumption of advising another member of Congress, and I do my best not to. And so all I can tell you is that I think we have no choice but to put massive new attention at the youngest levels of education in America today. And it's back to this question, and all these studies that have ever been done. If you can't read by the age of 10, you have not a little bit more chance, but like a 10 or 15 times greater chance of ending up in jail. And I think we really have to recognize that we have to start at the beginning. And then we also have to acknowledge that there's some things our society has done better than we might suspect. I mean, community colleges are something no society ever had. We need them for a variety of reasons. One, for catch-up, one for cost, but also for some ways of organizing into the education build into a work environment. And then at the higher academic levels, I just hope that people recognize that the most fun disciplines are ones that they can keep up forever. And so it seems to me English is a great major, but if you go to universities around the country, the largest major is increasingly business administration, which has relevance, and I don't deny that. And then at your more elite institutions, the biggest major is the Department of Economics. And so everyone is looking in a kind of direction that is that seems to be tied to a job, and I respect that a great deal. But I think one's really missing the big picture if universities don't kind of recalculate what education is all about.
Forgive my enthusiasm. Dorothy Kaczynski, the director of the Phillips Collection, but it's all about education, and maybe a query about whether we're our best advocates in arts and the humanities. I had the privilege of being part of a one-day American Art Museum director's junket to Capitol Hill, but to the Department of Education. And I was stunned by how little our colleagues and the professionals at the Department of Education knew about what, from my perspective as a museum professional over decades, has been a reinvention of what a museum is expected to do, as we've done the heavy lifting as our public school system has waned in its robustness. And I thought, my goodness, we're obviously not doing a very good job of communicating the role that museums and libraries and other cultural institutions play, because they really didn't know all about the educational endeavors. And I would welcome so much any thoughts that you would have about how we can be better advocates.
Well, there's no secret to advocacy. It's very straightforward, and it's very educative. Now, one of the things that everybody in the arts and humanities have in common, that they're rather educated people that know how to communicate. And so my sense is you work at that. And then you look at some aspects of American history. As you may know, my wife did a small book on Jacob Lawrence for the Phillips Collection.
I do know.
And one of the things that really sticks out in my mind in this book was a picture of a young African American in Harlem named Jacob Lawrence. And he's pictured at a summer program that was part of a federal program. And he's in a class, and what just stunned me was all of these kids in this class were wearing ties. And my image of an artist doesn't wear a tie. And yet this was a matter of total pride. And so when you think of sports, you're thinking about, among other things, after-school activities. And I think we've really missed the boat in the after-school activity issue on both the arts and humanities. And what can be done to keep people enthused after school and in the summers. And I think those are the kinds of programs one would think about. And so, for example, everybody knows there are summer programs for basketball in this country. And that's terrific. I'm all for it. But why shouldn't there also be some summer programs in sculpture? Maybe reading history. I mean, and maybe that's a way of picking up on that our school year is shorter than some school years of other countries in the world. But I think we're going to have to think about these things.
Sidney Lawrence.
Best thing I've heard today is that activities for youngsters.
I'm Sidney Lawrence. Can you hear me? I'm Sidney Lawrence. I'm an artist. wearing a tie.
Good.
Well, you know,
I'm also
standing
on
up
your-
for the poets here, too.
Very true. I actually am on your wall, I think, but never mind. I'm also an art critic. My question has to do with, first I was going to ask what you thought about film in terms of the humanities and also the arts a little bit, but then I was thinking about it, and I actually want to know how you might think the one things that the kids do where they could be reached is through the broad screen culture that we have now, all the things that people hold in their hands and look at home, as well as going to the movies and renting DVDs. And do you have any ideas about how that might help humanities, the muscle of humanity, get into people's brains? And also, are you funding any things like that?
Well, we do film. In fact, one of my surprises was just how many films we had done, and I'm in fact looking at whether or not some of these films can be translated in other languages that can be sent abroad. These are films from archives, but I do think films are pretty fabulously creative. Now there are extremes, as you know. We just had a film that cost $500 million. And it's, by the way, in my view, a bridging cultures movie about bridging cultures in the future. But it might be cheaper to buy a book about Thucydides and the Peloponnesian Wars, and you might get similar lessons of a similar kind. But films are absolutely extraordinary in their power, in their reach, in their creativity, and it's astonishing how young people are doing more. And I mean, grade school people are now making little movies. Where this goes is going to be just sensational for the future. And I'm told we're soon, well, actually we do now have 3D TVs. And so this is a film world, and so I wish we were more. That is in resources in some ways, but I will tell you, I was giving a speech about a month ago, and I like to pride myself in writing my own speeches, but I asked the department or my agency to come up with a paragraph for me on all the numbers of what we've done in total over the past. And this paragraph came back, and it was perfectly adroitly written, except I looked at it and refused to use the paragraph because I wanted to cry how small the numbers were. And so when you say, do we do films? Yes, we do. If you say, do we make much of a mark? No. But we do the best we can with limited resources.
I think we have time for one more question. Jonathan Katz?
I'm Jonathan Katz. I direct the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies. When you talked about the need for cultures to understand each other globally, I thought, well, here's clearly an area of common interest between the State Department and NEH. When you talked about the need to educate young people in reflective capacity, I thought, well, here's an opportunity for a partnership with the Department of Education and NEH. And I've seen sometimes these kinds of partnerships institutionalized, and the National Endowment for the Arts has a partnership with the Department of Education called the Arts Education Partnership, and it's spanned administrations. I wondered where you see long-term strategic partnerships for NEH, either within the federal government or with public interest groups.
Well, we do work with other agencies. The three we historically have worked the most with in terms of dollar interrelationships are the Library of Congress, the Institute of Museum and Library Services, and the National Science Foundation. But we've also done projects with the Department of Education, and we certainly work with the Department of State. Now, state is not a great reservoir for resources. They're a pretty tightly run ship. But clearly, how we interrelate with other institutions and work together is one way of using capacities of each or two or three in different ways. And I think we're going to have to do more of that, and it would be helpful.
Jim, before we close, you know, you're here surrounded by some of the nation's leaders in the arts, culture, humanities, and education, and there are many, many more people on television and the internet. You know, are there any parting words that you'd like to make, or actually any advice you might want to offer in this time of economic challenge and spiritual confusion?
Well, let me say two things. I mean, everybody in this town knows that all presidents want an economist with one arm so that they don't say on the one hand and the other. But as much as there are difficulties, if you were to take the arts and the humanities, the United States of America, by a quantum measure, leads the world. And there is no one close. And so, in some ways, the real challenge is that we continue this. And there is real prospect that the competition out there is going to make that very hard. And so one of the great circumstances is, how do you not flub as a society? The National Endowment for the Humanities is one very small institution, but it's an emblematic one, and I hope we're able to preserve it in the way it is. But the bigger issue always is where we are as a society itself. And America is facing these challenges that are severe economic, they're severe international, and they're really testing to our people. And this is a test that we've got to rise above. And I will tell you, I just went and I just visited one of the finest humanities programs we've ever helped fund, a small exhibit in New York at the New York Historical Society on Lincoln in New York. And I never really thought that Lincoln had much of a presence in New York, or it mattered, and it ends up that it mattered a great deal in a whole host of ways. But some of these pictorial circumstances of a group called the Copperheads, who were for slavery, against Lincoln being able to control the militia of the state of New York. A group called the Brooklyn's Sophoristics. I mean, these are really incredible terms that were absolutely in the North, holding ideas that you would think would be 16th century, and then contrasted with an unbelievably enlightened leader and enlightened leadership around the country of a very different ilk. And Lincoln helped lead this country, but the country helped lead Lincoln. And that's the way we are today. We've got these challenges, and the question is whether the really great instincts in our country are going to come out. And if they don't, we're in trouble. If they do, watch out, world. This place is going to take off.
Thank you, Chairman Jim Leach, for coming to the Aspen.